Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Elliot, please go ahead.
Why, thank you, Rochelle. Hello, everyone. My name is Elliot Markowitz, and I'm the Director of Strategic Content here at Summit Business Media. And welcome to today's webcast titled Implementation Update from the Trenches. And this event is brought to you by Tech Decisions and CastleBay Consulting, and sponsored by Zuber Insurance Software, ISCS, Maple Technologies, and Guidewire. This is the final installment of a three-part webcast series. If you missed the first two parts, you can simply go to propertycasualty360.com, and you can see the archived version. I will be your moderator for this event, but before we get to the topic, let's get some simple housekeeping items out of the way first. This event is completely interactive, and we do mean that. It incorporates many of today's social media tools, so you can now tweet or directly post information to your Facebook and or LinkedIn page right from the console. You don't have to open up a new browser to do so. Just scroll along the bottom of the screen, click on the social networking widget of your choice, and have fun with it. We encourage you to share. Also, if you have a question for one of our speakers, please type it in the Ask a Question field on your console. We will see that question come in, and we will get to it either during the live Q&A at the end of the event or at some point during the webcast. We will answer as many questions as possible, so we invite you to ask away. If you don't get to your question, you may receive an email response. Also, you can click on the Resource Center widget, scroll along and see that Resource Center widget right there, and you could download a copy of the slides to your desktop if you care to have a copy for your viewing pleasure. In addition, there are some other customizable functions to be aware of. Every window you currently see, and that's from the slide window to the Q&A pane, it can either be enlarged or collapsed. So if you want to change the look and feel of your console, mix it up a little bit, go right ahead and do so. Just do whatever works for you. Finally, there will be some polling questions sprinkled throughout this event. We want you to be interactive. We want you to participate. So please, when you see them pop up, click on the most appropriate response, and we will share the overall responses with the audience. We won't single anybody out. So please participate in those polls. Remember, the more interactive you are, the more valuable this experience will be for you. Now let's get to today's topic and speakers and why you are all here. Well, assuming the insurance carrier has successfully identified it and contracted with a suitable vendor for appropriate software, all that remains is to implement that software. Well, that sounds simple enough, right? Well, the replacement of core insurance applications is risky, it's lengthy, and it can be stressful. These projects consume years, millions of dollars, and large amounts of the corporate resource. To stand a fighting chance of success, the insurer needs to focus on what is essential, constantly patrol the project's boundaries for invading requirements, manage the vendors, and manage the client expectations. There's a lot going on, and there is a lot riding. This webcast will highlight key issues to be considered and best practices to be implemented that promote successful projects, and that's such as differentiating between programs and projects, requirements gathering, methodologies, project health checks, and approaches to data conversion. So you're going to get all that information from our speaker lineup. So here with us today to discuss these issues are, we have George Grieve again. He's CEO of CastleBay Consulting, and you can see his bio right there. And following George, we'll have Ralph Vagnoni. He's Vice President of Delivery Services of CastleBay Consulting, and you can read Ralph's bio right there as well. But before we officially turn it over to George, let's roll out our first audience polling question. So, Rochelle, if you can push that out, that would be appreciated. And there it goes. And just click on the most appropriate response. Basically, are you planning a core systems replacement project in the next 12 to 24 months? Are you currently involved in a core systems replacement project? Or have you completed a core systems replacement in the past 12 to 24 months? Please click on the most appropriate response. We will get to these overall results at some point later in the broadcast. But in the meantime, let's turn it over to George Grieve, CEO, CastleBay Consulting, and this is his third part in this series. So take it away, George.
Elliot, thank you, and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us in the third and final webinar of this part of our overall Shop Talk Community Series for 2013. For those of you that have joined us previously, some of this is going to be familiar. It's not meant to be repetitive. The theme we're trying to get across here is that the three core components of our whole Shop Talk thought process, the vendor community, vendor selection, and major core system replacement or modernization are really indivisibly linked. And so we try and reset, if we can, the context in each one of these webinars. So for those of you that joined us previously, in April, we talked about the software marketplace. In June, we talked about selecting vendors. And today, of course, here we are talking about implementing the software we selected from those vendors. For those of you who missed those webinars, archived versions of those are available at various places. PropertyCasualty360.com, CastleBayConsulting.com. You can request them. We've sent links in prior CastleBay Illuminators, and also Tech Decisions Magazine sends out newsletters that also have links. So there's plenty of ways of getting these if you haven't already seen them. Also, just let me say, the second wave of our Shop Talk community, which is a series of podcasts, are now underway. We have recorded 3, and we hope and anticipate that by next week we'll start publishing those, which again you can get through Property Casualty 360 or get links from CastleBay or look for the various newsletters that are coming out. So today we're going to talk about not why projects succeed and fail, but we're going to talk about the key elements in making these things succeed. And again, for those of you that joined us previously, you've seen this slide and the next 2 slides. This is a Pricewaterhouse study that came out in April of this year. And the highlight, and I've left the 3 slides in here, but I'm going to move forward to the 3rd one. And obviously you can dwell on the prior 2. And indeed, you can go and get the original report itself if you're interested. But the sum and substance of this report basically says approximately 30% of core system replacement projects succeed. And the definition of success is that the project was completed on time, within budget, and it basically met its original goals. 53%, the large chunk in the middle here, are projects that Pricewaterhouse describes as being challenged. And what that basically means is either the project missed its budget, missed its timeline, and more or less hit its functional and business goals, or vice versa, or some combination thereof. In other words, it was a compromised event. And then thirdly, 18% here, projects are actually listed as having failed. That means the project was abandoned or canceled due to it being unable to meet its cost, schedule, or customer expectations. So, the story so far. Well, actually, before we go to the story so far, Elliot, let me ask, do we have poll results for question number 1?
Sure. Rochelle, if you can push those out, let's see what the audience said. And here you go, George. It looks like 46% said they are planning a core systems replacement project in the next 1 to 2 years. 44% said they're currently involved in one. And just under 10% said they completed one in the past 1 to 2 years.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us. It sounds like you're in the right place today.
Absolutely.
Hopefully this is relevant. Hopefully it is also useful. So, Elliot, let's ask poll question number 2 before we continue, please.
Yeah, let's drill down a little bit deeper. So we're going to roll out the second polling question now, and we're going to get to the results again later in the broadcast. Please click the most appropriate response, and we're simply going to ask you, for those currently or recently involved in core systems replacement projects, there are your choices. Does the project look likely to complete on time or budget while meeting the scope and quality objectives? Does the project look likely to significantly exceed either time or budget? Now, that would be nice, while meeting scope and quality objectives. Or does the project look likely to only partially be completed or be stopped? And just be honest, I'm not calling anybody out here. We just want to get a sample size of the audience's experiences to share with everybody. So please vote on that, and I'll turn it back over to George.
And the interesting point for us as a small statistical sample will be the extent to which the group on the webinar today reflects the results that we were just looking at from the Pricewaterhouse study, or whether they're different. So the story so far, as we have said in our prior webinars, first of all, the vendors are better overall than they have ever been. We covered this in our last webinar and to some extent in the one before as well. Vendors are writing better software. You as customers have more acquisition options. You can buy licenses, you can rent in the cloud, you can pay for clicks, you can buy for seats, you can pay as you go, you can pay up front, you can pay for delivery. There is better pricing and value proposition. These systems have larger functional footprints than they've ever had before. They have more useful functionality. And their price, although there's no formal study of this as far as I can tell, is either going down in inflation-adjusted dollars or is staying the same as the value and footprint of the software increases. You have more and better implementation options. We discussed the best of both, which is you can take a suite from a vendor and implement it on a best-of-breed approach, or you can take best-of-breed components and build those into a suite from different vendors. And the vendors in general attempt very seriously these days to be good partners. They are, by and large, committed to their client's success because they know that their client's success in the long term is their success. And any vendor that thinks there's a short-term proposition to be had in the P&C marketplace doesn't know our market very well. So for all those reasons, then, the vendor marketplace is better. The vendors are better. The software's better. There's never been, in my opinion, a better time to buy third-party software than now. I may revise that in a few years, depending on what happens with cloud delivery and some of these other options. But for right now, it's better than it's ever been. Carriers in general, I think, are getting somewhat better at selecting vendor solutions. But the core systems outcomes, as we just saw, whilst they have improved somewhat, they haven't improved as much as they should have. So let's get to today's topic, which is why. And I'm going to give you some comments really from a high level. We have the pleasure of having Ralph Fagnoni with us today. Ralph runs some of our larger, more complex implementations for CastleBay and is nearer to some of the other projects that we have than I am. So I am going to do the sort of higher level view. Ralph is going to take you down into the trenches somewhat. So first of all, carriers continue to make suboptimal vendor choices or make more suboptimal vendor choices than they should. This doesn't necessarily mean that an inappropriate vendor gets chosen when a more appropriate vendor is available. But by the time we get to the end of the software search, we're kind of feeling pressurized to get on with the project, and sometimes we don't finish doing all the homework we really need to do. And that means that sometimes the choice of the vendor almost becomes secondary to the quality and depth of the knowledge that's developed by the carrier during the selection process. And the important point here with reference to implementations is that knowledge is the basis on which you and the vendor agree an implementation approach, an implementation timeline, and an implementation budget. And then you take those numbers, figures, dates, and you go in front of either a senior executive board or a board of directors, and you ask them for money and time. If it turns out that there are things about you that the vendor doesn't know, or there are significant things about the vendor that you don't know, and neither party knows the other party doesn't know, that can significantly affect the implementation. And if we have to go back for additional time or we have to go back for additional money, doesn't mean we chose the wrong vendor, just means we didn't know everything we should have known and could have known before we went and asked for money. And as those of you that have been through this before, and those of you who haven't can easily imagine, going back to senior executives or going back to the board and going back to the well one more time for additional money and or time is a difficult thing to do, and it creates doubt in the minds of the people who are not involved in the project and can actually lead to the beginnings of the fraying of the edges of those projects. So an implementation project, and these are large, they're complex, they're difficult to do, may suffer from some actions that are born right out of the selection process itself. Secondly, carriers continue to struggle with the scope and complexity of core system modernization projects. This is one of those deals where I'm always reminded of the sort of cliched story, and those of us that are parents have all been through this. The first time you are proud, expecting parents, and your wife begins to, show that she's actually bearing a child, you get all kinds of, free and friendly advice from all kinds of people, and they kind of nudge you in the elbow and say, you have no idea how tired you're going to be. And you listen and you say, yeah, I'm sure you're right. And then when you become a parent and you're so tired, you're zombified, and you can hardly put one foot in front of the other, and then you meet somebody and they're pregnant, and you say, you have no idea how tired. And of course, none of us have any idea because we haven't been there yet. And these projects, not to over-dramatize them, are really something like that. Core system modernization projects, almost by definition, happen in carrier companies every between, let's say, 15 and 30 years. So by definition, most of you haven't done one before. And if you haven't done one before, it's really hard to do something that's big and complex and stressful and figure it out kind of in flight. It's almost impossible to do that. Secondly, carriers, especially small and mid-sized companies, lack some of the infrastructure and formal disciplines that are required in order to be able to do one of these projects. If you've been a maintenance shop for the last 15 or 20 or 25 years, you may or may not have a formal QA department and a formal QA process. Testing a full suite implementation is magnitudes more complex than testing even a significant maintenance upgrade. You may or may not have a formal project management office or formal project disciplines. And again, doing maintenance projects, you can get away with those in a relatively informal way. You cannot do these kinds of projects without formal plans and approaches and documents and sign-off. That leads to our next bullet point on formal disciplines. You need a methodology. The good news is oftentimes the vendors will bring a methodology, and usually these days it's more of an agile flavor of a methodology than a waterfall, which is generally a good thing. But planning, requirements gathering, scope control, freezing scope, change control, these things are just necessary structural components to keep one of these projects in a framework. Otherwise, as Elliot said earlier, if you're not patrolling the boundaries for stray requirements, you're suddenly going to find that, some way into this thing, you've got a significantly larger project than you had planned in the first place. And then finally, financial resources. If you don't have the skills and you don't have all the resources and you don't have all the formality, one alternative is to buy at least some of it. But if you're a smaller carrier, you've probably spent the vast majority of your budget contracting with the vendor. And so this places even more stress on your in-house folks to be able to do this work. Finally, with reference to this page, this kind of project requires an enterprise-level focus and consistency that's hard to get in the first place, and it's harder to maintain over time. These projects can take years. They obviously vary with the size of company, the number of interfaces, the number of lines of business, the number of states you write in. There's a bunch of obvious variables, but they're serious, they're sustained, and they're lengthy. And if you cannot get the commitment from senior management, first of all, to doing the project, and then maintain that commitment over time, you can find yourselves in trouble. Another thing is, and we hear this a fair amount, a surprising amount, is a lot of companies, especially smaller companies, assume that once they've done a deal with a vendor, they're kind of done. The vendor's going to tell them what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. And that is simply not the case. So this diagram here has two circles. One circle is smaller, and it's inside the other circle, which is larger. And the smaller circle is labeled vendor, and the larger circle is labeled client. It could be labeled carrier. And these are the responsibilities and splits of responsibility between you, the carrier, and the vendor with whom you have contracted. And if you look down these lists very quickly, really the vendor's main job is to install their software, to lead the configuration of their software, to do what they need to do to help you integrate all of your other component systems in your legacy suite to their software and do some initial testing and manage their own team. You as the client have to provide the requirements. You have to test and accept the software. You have to do your portion of the integration work. And then you have some other things you need to think about. The vendor may or may not have any thoughts on or any assistance for you. And different vendors do different things in this area. Data conversion. You have an in-force book of business. You have an in-force book of claims. How and when do you get them out of the legacy world and into this new environment? There's all kinds of issues there about data mapping, data cleanliness, completeness of data. There are all kinds of issues to do with in-force conversions, and there are other issues to do with conversion at renewal. Conversion at renewal takes longer, but is lower risk. In-force conversion should be done quicker, but is more expensive and is significantly more risky. That's a decision really that the client has to make that the vendor may or may not have some ways of helping with, or may have no way of helping with, and no interest in, they're interested in the outcome, but they're not participants. So that's data conversion. Training and rollout. In what sequence are you going to roll this out? Who's going to get it first? Are you an agency company? Are you a direct company? Who are you going to train? Are you going to train trainers, and will they train other people? How will you sunset the legacy systems? How will you coordinate with the vendor? All these issues are carrier issues, not vendor issues. And I came across a quote, Strategy Meets Action, one of the analyst companies in our space, just produced a report. I think it just came out this last few weeks. And here's a quote from the author, Karen Furtado, which I thought was very timely. An examination of the total effort involved in a core system implementation shows that approximately 30% of the time expended involves the actual core system software. The remaining 70% of the effort is spent developing requirements, dealing with systems integration, managing the data, and testing and deploying the system. So 70% of the work, crudely put, is carrier responsible work, and 30% is vendor responsible work. A lack of recognition of that does not get you off on a good basis for a successful implementation. My final set of remarks are to do with management issues. Management issues can derail these kinds of projects. As we said earlier, depending on the shape and size of your organization and the complexity, the lines of business, etc., replacement projects can take years to complete. And the management, and I'm talking the executive management, must promote and maintain that focus. If a company wants to get something done, the senior executives of that company have to tell the people who are going to do the work that it needs to be done and that it's important and that their performance will be judged, at least in part, on the outcome of this major effort. As importantly, and sometimes we miss this one, management also has got to be prepared to postpone other corporate initiatives where possible and recognize the impact of unplanned interruptions that happen during the life cycle of these projects, for instance, regulatory changes. The fact of the matter is, these projects can, especially in smaller companies, basically they can suck the oxygen out of the building. They involve, especially if you're doing a suite implementation, they basically involve the entire company. These are not IT projects. They involve all of the business operating units, underwriting, policy service, claims, billing, accounting, product compliance, the agency plan. And if you involve these people, and by the way, you need some of the best people from each of these departments, not the folks with nothing to do, the most busy, important, key people. If you take on a project like this, you obviously weaken and lower the ability of the enterprise to do other enterprise-level projects. And this is something that we see fairly frequently. There's just no recognition of. So the senior execs sign on the line. they all slap their hands, dust off their shirts, walk out of the room, and they assume they've done everything they need to do for this project to succeed. Not true. They have to support the project over time, and they have to fight off other things that will suck resources out of this project and debilitate the ability of the project team to finish. Finally, people who approve these projects sometimes change jobs, move on, and retire. And these very events themselves can cause delays, interruptions, or even cancellation of projects. We have seen and continue to see on an ongoing basis, some very large, complex, expensive core system modernization project, which was begun by one CIO or one chief operating officer who disappears for one reason or another during the life cycle of that project, and then someone comes along and they inherit that project. The first thing they do is they take a look at it and they say, I don't know if this is going to succeed. I am in a honeymoon period. This is my chance to review this thing, to either reset it or even possibly to stop it. And we see those events occur as well. So that was a set of comments, if you will, from a higher level perspective, based on what we see sort of generally going on, with these types of projects in CastleBay's marketplace. I'm going to hand over to Ralph momentarily here, and as I say, he's going to take you a little bit more into the trenches. But before we do that, Elliot, can we get the results of poll number 2?
Absolutely. Well said, George. So, Rochelle, please push out those results from polling question 2, and we'll read them to the audience. And we asked for those currently or recently involved in a core systems replacement project. If you take a look, George, 51% said the project looks likely to complete on time while meeting scope, which is good. Just under 30% said the project looks likely to significantly exceed either time, budget, while meeting scope, and under 20% said it looks like it's going to be partially complete or stopped.
If these results hold, then I think that's terrific. Congratulations to everybody. That is obviously significantly better than the results that we saw from the price poll. We don't have the opportunity, but it would be an interesting exercise if we could ask the same question of the same group of people in another year or two and see if these results were any different. But for those of you that are involved in these, first of all, good luck and Godspeed. They're hard. Congratulations for taking them on. And if we end up with these kinds of results, then I think that's a terrific thing. I'm done with my part. Elliot, if you would like to introduce Ralph, we'll go down into the trenches here a little bit. Thank you.
Absolutely. And, George, you're absolutely right. It seems like it's pretty good news from our audience, and they're fairly sophisticated. So that's fantastic. Well, George, part of the presentation is complete, but he will be available for the Q&A. So if you do have any questions for George as well as Ralph, please type them in the Ask a Question field. We already got a handful of questions, and we'll be presenting them to our panelists after Ralph's presentation. So let's officially turn it over to Ralph. Here is Ralph Vagnoni, and again, as a reminder, he's Vice President of Delivery Services at CastleBay Consulting. I pass the baton over to you, Ralph.
Thank you, Elliot, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to change my opening a little bit here after looking at some of these slides, and especially the polling results that were just shared. Seeing that 50% of the participants are fearing that their project would not be met on time, or even the 20% or so who thought it may fail, is kind of scary. And I would kind of question what we saw in the PwC slide. 53% are troubled and 20% actually fail. And I would argue that a lot of projects get implemented, and the project teams typically feel successful. They've implemented a core system, whether it be billing, claims, or policy admin. They feel like they got the job done, but the perception yet is that the project is still a failure. And that perception typically comes from expectations that were set early on in the project, shared with executives, and never adjusted during the life cycle of the project. So with that, I'm going to share a story with you about a client that we worked with about 2 years ago. Let me see here. Nobody likes our system. And my point here is that not all systems fail because of their implementation. Some fail because of what was implemented. CastleBay was retained by roughly $800 million P&C carrier to help them with a core system replacement policy admin in the personal line space. This company had undertaken building out quoting for a couple states in both home and auto, and the project was suffering. So we were retained to help them get that project back on track and then implement full policy administration as well as a customer portal. So in my initial meetings with the executives, they talked about the importance of the technology and how agents can do endorsements and customers could service themselves. And, the project really needed some focus and needed to get done. They needed to get out there to, sell business, and these things were key to their business objectives. What I also heard from them is nobody likes our system. It's slow. You can't use it. Agents hate it. So with that in mind, I went and I met with the project team early on, and I took a look at the software they had built to date. And this is an insurance company who, like George talked about earlier, doesn't really do large system replacements. I think the last one they did was some kind of mainframe system, probably 20 years before this project. And I looked at the software that they had built, and it collected data. You could rate a policy, get a premium. It printed a deck that looked like the deck that's just on the mainframe. And in talking to them about how they felt about the project, they talked about, too, a lack of leadership, lack of management support. Is this really a priority? So you have those typical issues that you may hear about. But again, I heard nobody likes our system. So I'm looking at this and I'm saying to myself, well, how bad could it be? And why don't people like it? I've just looked at it. It does, what it should. It's maybe not as pretty as it could be, but it gets a policy out the door, or, at least a quote. So I went and met with the marketing representatives and actually the vice president of marketing, and he again echoed nobody likes our system. So we agreed to go out into some agency visits. So we went out to see the ultimate consumer of the system, if you will. And we talked with them, and we asked them how the system performed against peers and what do and don't you like about our system. And here is what I heard. Your system makes me enter the entire application before it's rejected for underwriting reasons. Tell me you don't want the business up front. Well, that would be very frustrating. We probably could ask several questions up front to rule out that piece of business. There are too many refreshes. Essentially, the system was over-engineered. Rather than ask, 5 questions straightforward, they ask one, and then they run an AJAX call and, populate 2 more if appropriate based on the first answer. And this happened after every question, where maybe, they should have put up 5 questions and just had an NA box or something like that. For X line of business, we never go to you guys first. Your price is always too high. We only place business with you that nobody else wants. That's kind of scary. The system is slow. Okay. You guys ask a gazillion questions on your applications, and, trampolines and whatever else, and how far am I from a fire hydrant? And some things matter from an underwriting perspective, but does the fact that I'm a butcher really matter to you? An interesting one was about retained documents, and this is more of a personal lines issue than it is a commercial lines issue. But, we give things like good student discount. And we ask agents to keep a copy of the report card in their office, and we never check to see that it's there. Why put an agent through that hassle? Why even ask the question? Let them check a box. You're never going to verify it. Just give them the credit. And lastly, I can issue anything I want, with respect to homeowners, but, X number of days within that 60-day window, you come back and you cancel the policy about 10% of the time. You could do a better job of telling me you don't want my risk. For agents, this has a big implication. They have to now go resell it. They're a little embarrassed and what have you. So I asked myself the question, in this particular case, what exactly is wrong with the system? All right, it's slow. I could fix that or help the IT department fix that. And, in large part, after everybody agrees on scope and everybody signs off on a project, it typically becomes an IT project. IT has to deliver, and I think they forget that it's an organizational project, and the business people are partners in this as well, and we'll touch on that some more later. But these lessons learned here on this page really focus on things that as a project leader, as a project manager, you're in an IT role, or maybe you're a business person. But these are the things that I feel our business people really need to understand before we start building software, because it's going to have a great impact on how we build software for them, and ultimately how that software is perceived by the end consumer, whether it be an agent, a CSR, or a person in a field office. Companies need to understand the market they want to be in. Another carrier we worked with in the last year, as a matter of fact, acquired another company. And this company did personalized business in X states, and they wanted to start writing commercial lines. So Quick put out this BOP program, BOP Rater, what have you. And nobody's buying the business. They got a couple agents who are their personalized agents, but they're not placing any commercial. Well, these personalized agents have a very good network of individuals, but they weren't really wired into the business community and therefore couldn't offer customers who would want to buy this product. So they made big plans, they spent some money, and then they weren't selling the product. So is that project a success or a failure? Well, the system went in, but it's a failure in the sense that they really didn't understand the market. In knowing your agent or your consumer, ease of doing business is really, really important. One of the first things that agents care about is giving them something to sell, and typically that means you have to have the right price. Independent agents compete with other independent agents who may have different carriers, and all of them are competing with online direct marketers, Geico, Progressive, and what have you. They need price to sell. They want fast, easy processes, and this talks to things like, you should be using pre-fill so they don't have to type in all the information. Don't ask them a lot of questions. Don't overly edit things. You should understand what you're looking for, the coverages you want to offer. Don't put that burden on the agent. After they write the business, they really don't want you to bother them. They don't want you sending them letters for follow-up. They don't want you search and retain documents. They want to forget about it. These guys are small businesses. They have expenses like rent and paying for staff, and commissions are tight, the market's tight, and they just want it to be quick, fast, and easy. And if you're not like that, they may go to a company that is for a $5 or a $10 difference in premium. Service my customer when I can't. They like the fact that insurance company put up self-service portals. An agent, as an insured, I can go in and do my own endorsement. I didn't call the agent, but yet I added a vehicle, and they're going to get 10% of that premium. And, of course, they all care about claim payment and timely commission payment. So maybe that one goes without saying. With the perspective of an agent and an insured, for those of you doing direct market, what does ease of doing business really mean? Well, again, they want fast quotes. Don't ask them a lot of questions. Use pre-fill. Only ask what you care about, only what you're going to verify. Multiple platforms for varying services. I haven't found anybody yet who wants to do a BOP or even a personal auto or homeowner's quote on an iPhone. Quoting applications on iPhones, bad idea. However, an application that can be used in the event of a loss is probably a good idea. So we have a loss app. You hit a button, it dials a number, directs you to the company, or maybe for roadside assistance or something to that effect. I'm running kind of long on time here, so you can review these slides later. But basically, know who your customer is before you build software and build things they care about. So taking the focus back to IT projects, I want to talk a little bit about managing expectations, scope, some things about human resources, project management versus leadership, and lastly, focusing on the customer. Managing expectations. Again, trying to get your project from that 53 up into the 29. Expectations are set at the beginning of a project, but how often is the baseline reset? How often when you get a change control item as a project manager, go back and say, oh, you need to up the budget, and that's the budget I'm being held accountable for? My experience is most budgets are set in the beginning of the year. They're cast in stone, and you're measured against that. So what can you do? You can try to offset some of the false expectations that are set, usually during a sales process if you're doing this for the first time. Software sales guys come in, they promise the moon. You can do anything with enough time and money. And now, unfortunately, you as the implementer have to deal with that perception of your internal customer, the people who are paying the bills, the people you're reporting to. I try to keep all my conversations with the business folks and executives around the functionality we're going to receive and deliver, and less about the type of database we're going to be using to support the application. I try to make executives put in the effort. I'll email a document. I schedule a meeting. In the meeting, I make sure they have time to read it. I ask questions that prove that they read it, and I ask them to sign it. Again, make it a conversation. Make sure the executives understand what you're saying. Put politics on the table early. There are some uncomfortable issues that come up during these implementations, whether it be related to staffing of a project team, behavior of a vendor, and I found that it's best just to put issues on the table in a tactful manner as soon as possible Most people you're working with have been through these kinds of things before, whether it be with other companies or similar type issues. You want to raise problems as quickly as you can with the sponsors, steering committee, executives on the project. Another thing I like to do is make sure that the customer who's going to evaluate us, the person who's going to put us in that 53 category, understands that these project plans are based on assumptions and opinions, not necessarily facts. I put together a project plan working with a vendor, and it says we have X resource and this and that, but not every resource is as talented as the other, and if you lose your best architect, it's going to have an impact to the project. So, again, we made an assumption that this architect would be available for the whole project. Well, now if they're not, a date may change. And I try to make that clear up front. I like them to understand that dates, money, time, all this stuff can change if these assumptions change. And that's really key in managing expectations. This is my set of assumptions. This is how they're changing. Reset my baseline. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about scope control and resetting expectations. You need to have a vigorous change control process. It's a lot of overhead, but it really will drive change back to, if nothing else, the executive sponsor who has to sign off. You asked for this when we started. You've changed your mind. It has an implication. So change control is something I recommend very highly in helping to reset expectations. And then the rest of the bullets are repeated for emphasis, but excuse me. You want to communicate this change, make sure they reset the baseline for you. If they don't, you're stuck in that 53%. Human resource concerns. Depending on whether you're the vendor or whether you're doing your first system, you may have a bunch of people supporting a legacy environment, mainframe programmers, and they may not be the right people for the job on this new project. You can teach them the technology, but they still have the mindset of mainframe programmers. And what you'll wind up with is something that looks very much like a mainframe program on a new technology platform. So along the lines of anybody within an organization that hasn't undertaken a project like this in recent time, you're going to want to infuse thought within that group. You're going to want to make sure that they understand that go out to Amazon, go out to whatever website, a peer or a competitor, and let them see what other people are doing before they embark on designing software for you guys internally. At the end here, there are 2 bullets I want to touch on. Domain experience. I found the most successful programmers, BAs, project managers, all have insurance domain experience. If you're bringing in people from out of industry, great. 1 or 2 might give you another perspective on how to do things. It's a fresh look. But the core of rating, underwriting, the kinds of edits you need to ensure that the risk has been qualified, you really need somebody who understands insurance. And that's, to my last point, working with an offshore organization. You don't get a lot of that. It's hard to see the product you're really buying offshore. There's communication issues, there's time issues, there's language issues, and we can spend an hour probably just on that topic, but you want to try to mitigate that risk, which is what the next slide is about. So what can you do to help mitigate some of these risks? Well, you want to train your technical staff that you're using internally on the new product, and you want to give them time to learn to use that software before you ask them to build something. This will be a hard sell. Imagine you just contracted with the vendor, everybody's ready to get started, and you say, wait, we need 2 months because all of our internal employees need to learn to use this software before they try to build a system we're going to implement. We often hear, if I only knew now, or if I only knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have done it the same way. A month or 2 up front could save a project delay later of 3 or 4 months, but you'll never be able to prove it. But again, whether you call it a proof of concept, that you're creating some kind of leverageable code base, it's definitely a worthwhile activity for all of your staff to be involved in a smaller project before the real project. Here we talk about benchmarking, again, making them familiar with what's going on in the industry. How many programmers actually go out to an agent's office and look at competitor systems? I think it's a great idea. And again, my last bullet, offshoring is still a challenge. Again, it's been 10 years that we've been working with offshore partners, and I think the issues are still the same. Communication, things being taken literally, not always hearing no when you need to. With respect to project management and a PMO, what I found is PMOs serve a purpose, not to just call them bean counters, but they'll help you ensure that you're following a process. But typically, I don't find them to be leaders. They have a lot of acronyms associated with their name. They really don't know the insurance industry. They're brought in from outside because, of those acronyms. They're project administrators, not leaders. Leaders understand what's going on within the project. They're going to challenge their customers in ways that we talked about earlier. Methodology, I feel, is very important. You need structure to a project. You've got agile, lean, waterfall. I call it waterfalls because I don't think anybody does just straight waterfall anymore. But essentially, you want some kind of iterative approach where you're creating deliverables, sharing them with your customer before you move on. If you can handle it, you can do some developed concurrently. And lastly, you want to front load your riskiest parts of the project if you can. That way, if they drag out, they're not the long pole in the tent. So regardless of methodology, keep showing your customer what they're going to get. Show them that they're getting what they asked for. Because the more the customer sees, the more involved they are in the project, the more buy-in you're going to have, and the more likely you will be to succeed as a project team. Hopefully, again, moving you out of that 53% and into the successful column. Focus on the customer. I think that ultimately the end consumer of the product is going to make or break you. They're the ones who are going to say they love the system. You could be over budget. And if the CEO hears that every agent that he talks to loves your new system, I think they'll forgive the budget overrun. So, design with no training required in mind. Give them an app they can navigate that you don't have to train them on. It should be apparent how to use technology. Most people can shop on the internet. They know how to use browsers. When you label stuff, make sure it's in English. Don't show form numbers if you can avoid it, unless it's required by law for some reason or what have you. Your pick list should read, 100,000, not 100/200. Show the actual value. You want the system to have obvious flow, navigation, buttons that tell them where they're going. Of course, people want fast performance, and that's always going to be a key issue. If it's slow and they have to sit there watching the wheel spin, they're going to walk away from the app. Challenge yourself to follow IT industry standards, not necessarily pure companies. I've heard a lot about Dell when they first came out with the shopping cart. And when you picked a different hard drive, the price of the computer changed, and people were like, wow, why doesn't why doesn't the insurance system work that way, where when I up the limit, it shows me the incremental difference in a new total premium? And a lot of vendors in the industry have picked up on this, and you'll find these features within their applications. Pre-fill is just really important in both commercial and personal lines. Any data that you could put in there for them that those CSRs don't have to key, or that an insured, if you're doing direct market, doesn't have to key, is going to be great. Challenge your business partners to only collect verifiable data. Get away from collecting data that we don't really use or check. And lastly, look into what I'll call disruptive technologies, applications. And the one example I have is the Add to Car app. And an iPhone might not be good for doing a quote, but if you had an application that let an insured scan the tag on a car, the VIN, while they were purchasing the car, send that to you. You ask them if it's an add or replace, next page, verify coverage, boom. You ask them where they want the ID card mailed to, and you've just done an endorsement to add a vehicle via an iPhone. That's pretty slick. I don't know if there are many more uses for an iPhone in that kind of situation, but that's the kind of thinking that I think you need to have as you decide to invest money in applications. I think we're ready for our final poll.
Yeah. Before you finish the last couple of slides, Ralph, appreciate those thoughts and insights. Let's run through, the final poll. And Rochelle just popped it up right now, and it reads, for those currently or recently involved in a core systems replacement project, did the project have significant challenges? And there are your choices. No, it ran smoothly, or yes, managing expectations was a problem. Maybe it was scope control, resource issues, project management issues, or maybe it was the vendor itself. So please click on the most appropriate response. We'll share these results with you in a couple of minutes, and just going to ask Ralph to finish up and then get into the Q&A with the audience.
Great. So a closing thought. My experience, tolerance for slippage in projects. Customers seem to care least about cost because they care more about the functionality that the project is going to do what it needs to do, and you'll be able to service your customer. Time always seems to be a sticker. For whatever reason, and I'm sure you see this as well, once you set a date, people like to see you meet dates, and I've often seen that functionality will get pared away to meet a time frame. And those time frames are usually associated with getting a system rolled out, writing new premiums, bringing in new business. However, I would challenge that thinking by saying that what matters most is the consumer's perception of the application that you roll out, billing, claims, policy admin. If people like it and say good things about it, a lot of this other stuff is forgiven. These projects take years to implement. The stuff you're going to build will last for 10 or 15 years. A couple of months on time, a couple $100,000 on cost aren't really going to make a difference in the long run. And with that, I'll turn this back to either Elliot or George, and thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, Ralph. Before we jump into the Q&A, we're just going to flash the poll results up real quick. So, Rochelle, if you can do that. And there you go. So if you take a look at those results, for those currently or recently involved in the cost systems replacement project, did the project have significant challenges? And if you look, 8% said no. 30% said they're kind of blaming the managing expectations, something that obviously Ralph talked about. 43% scope control, 40% resource issue, 70% project management, and only 70% actually said it was the vendor issue. So now we've got a pretty good handle on where the audience stands on these issues. Let's open it up to a Q&A. And George, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Let me roll up. Let me run the first question by you, and if you think Ralph's more appropriate, just chime in. You said that only 30% of policy administrative projects succeed. What would you say is the number one criteria to look for in an implementation partner to make sure they're in that 30% range?
So let's talk really quickly about what we mean by an implementation partner. The implementation partner could be the software vendor, or it could be a third party that does the kind of work CastleBay does. It could be an SI. It could be a group of people that specialize, say, in quality assurance, or they have conversion tools, or some other specialized component of the project. So an implementation partner comes in a number of different flavors. But I'm certainly going to offer you one and only one answer, depending on whatever flavor you might have in mind as an audience member. And that is that your implementation partner needs to have done this before. We've said it in many different ways as we've talked today. These projects are fast-moving, they're big, they're stressful, they're complex. You can't learn them as you go. So one of the key things you can do if you have the luxury of having some money to spend is to spend some of that money to import expertise onto your project that can act, if you will, as the scout that rides ahead of you and make sure that they warn you there's a boulder around the corner or there's a hole in the road and help you avoid it. So, in short, the implementation partner should be able to lead you by the hand because they've been down the road before. Do you agree with that, Ralph, or you have a different take?
No, that would have been the same answer I've given, though I might have stated it differently. But, yeah, you definitely want a proven entity to work with.
Okay, let's jump to the next question and open it both to Ralph and George, and that is, are certain carriers more likely to have certain challenges? For instance, if it's a smaller carrier versus a larger carrier, or maybe where they're located, a remote carrier versus more of an urban carrier. How does that play into this?
My first thought with respect to geographic location is obtaining talented resources. Mm-hmm. If you're not around a major city, you may not find the quality of resource, or your expenses may go up because you have to import that resource. Being a smaller company, things could be challenging because you just have fewer people to do things, maybe smaller budgets. And I think off the cuff, those are my two first reactions. George, would you care to add anything?
Let me just offer, because with these kinds of projects, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. I agree with everything that Ralph just said. But let me add the comment for a larger carrier. They have more money to spend. They probably have more people, and they probably have more discipline and structure. So all those things are good. But larger carriers tend to be more complex. They tend to, by and large, write more lines of business, certainly in more states. So they're going to have a set of complexity issues probably that a smaller carrier is not going to have. Let's take one instance, integration points. A small carrier may have somewhere between 3 and 10 integration points. We have come across companies that measure their written premium in billions or even tens of billions, and they have literally 100 or more integration points. That's a decent proxy for the complexity thing.
Yeah, and I'll just add one benefit to being a smaller company is that the decision-making path is usually smaller. They may tend to be more entrepreneurial. The communication is better because typically you're reporting to one person, so you run into less of that. I have 5 or 6 different opinions and have to settle on one kind of stuff.
Those are all good points. We probably have time for one more question, then we got some party information for our audience. And this comes from Matthew from KPMG, and maybe, George, I'll open it up to you first. He asks, what is your recommendation on how to build a business case for doing a policy admin replacement? Premium uplift has too many other factors. Technology benefits are usually too small. What have you seen that is successful in selling the project?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure if I want to give anything away to KPMG. So thank you for joining us. Secondly, partly I'm hiding the fact that is actually an incredibly hard question to answer. The whole thing about ROI and cost justification is a very difficult area. And it's difficult for the reasons that were implied or stated in the question. If the project takes 3 to 5 years, am I still the same business at the end as I was at the beginning? There are variables that change over time to do with my market dynamics, my pricing, and all kinds of other things that would change those numbers regardless of what the system actually did. The long and the short of it is it's very hard to put together a decent finance-based business case for doing one of these projects. We try wherever we can to help our clients avoid having to do these types of business cases, and we try and suggest to them that the case for doing the project is usually based on existential issues to do with competition, changes in markets, agility, the ability to go into markets, and stay away where we possibly can from the financial implications. Some companies will go with that, some companies demand them. It's only a partial answer, but it's generally the answer we try and go with.
Ralph, any parting thoughts? Okay. Well, Rochelle, if you could push out our final polling question, we'd appreciate it. We just want to mention that the capstone of Shop Talk Community for 2013 will be a live one-day event in Philadelphia in November. And we'll be taking a deeper dive into the material that we have discussed in these 3 webcasts and podcasts. And again, if you missed the first 2, George mentioned a bunch of places we can go get them. Most specifically, you can go to propertycasualty360.com and you can view the archived version. But remember, space is limited, and we'd like feedback on how many people are interested in attending. So if you'd be interested in attending a live face-to-face Shop Talk Summit in November in Philadelphia, just click yes or no, and we'll be in touch with you, and we appreciate that. Well, that's about all the time we have for this webcast. I would like to thank you for joining us. We hope it was valuable to you. A special thanks to our guests, George and Ralph, for their time and insights. Also, a thank you to CastleBay Consulting and our sponsors, Zuber Insurance Software, ISCS, Maple Technologies, and Guidewire for their support. If you missed any part of this presentation, remember it will be archived shortly, so you can view it again or refer someone to it. Remember, you can also download the slides by just scrolling and clicking on the resource widget right there, so take advantage of that. Again, my name is Elliot Markowitz. Thank you for joining us, and have a great afternoon, everybody.